All right, I've got my laptop plugged in now, and we're ready to do the second part of this. This is the civilizations in the Americas, the Maya, Inca, and Aztec. So, some of you guys remembered this from the Carlos Museum packets. There's a lot at the Carlos about these particular civilizations. We talked about quipus. Remember the quipu, how they kept records with the knots? So, let's get started on this. I'm going to minimize myself so you guys can see the screen. Okay, so Aztecs were located up here in Mexico. You've got the Maya in Central America. Inca, really mostly around Chile and this whole coastal region here. So Aztec, Maya, and then Inca. That's your locator. So the Maya is where we're going to start. They were located in what is now the state of Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula. So by the first millennium BC, you have people there cultivating crops like corn. Now, corn is actually a genetically modified plant, which is kind of interesting. It started as a weed, and they figured out how to change it through the growth process and, make it something edible, which is kind of cool. An early civilization began to emerge along the Pacific coast. The area was a source of the cocoa trees. Now, this is on your test. The cocoa trees were used as a type of currency. And so chocolate was a thing. However, it wasn't the chocolate that we know today. Milk chocolate really wasn't invented until Hershey at the Hershey factory. There were some explorers who visited and they were given sort of like a fermented chocolate drink, and they did take it back to Europe, and that was part of what's known as the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is where you have certain items that were native to, say, South America, and they were taken back to Europe, and then vice versa. You have things in Europe that didn't exist in South America. So it was an exchange of items. And so, but you don't need to know that for your test. That'll probably be on your test when we talk about exploration, which we haven't gotten to yet. What you need to know is that the cocoa beans and cocoa trees even were used as currency, so they were very valuable. The Maya of the first millennium AD, there were a number of city states similar to what you had in ancient Greece, right? And even in like the Sumer, city states were just a common thing in the ancient world. They're sort of like urban centers. You might have had 100,000 residents in a large one. But something that's really cool though is they had temples in each one of these urban areas, and some of them are in vast vegetation today, so you can't find them. And they figured out how to locate them on satellite. There's a video about that where these scientists, they're looking at the satellite imagery. Well, the all the temples were made out of a certain type of material, and it caused the image on the satellite to be a lighter shade. So you'd have these little lighter shade circles, and they were able to use that as a map to locate all of these unknown Mayan ruins, which was really kind of neat. So, what about political structure, right? So, Mayan rulers were very powerful. Excuse me. So you have this class society, kind of like what I was saying about ancient China. The Mayans had it too, right? So you have a ruler surrounded by aristocrats whose wealth came through land ownership. So property ownership was important all throughout history. That wasn't just a thing that we came up with later on, right? Some people like to point the finger at the founders and say they're terrible because, you have all these voting requirements and things like that. You had to be a property owner to vote. Well, property ownership was evident in ancient times too. And so eventually, many nobles became priests or scribes at the royal court. Artisans and traders formed the middle class, and you have most people serving as farmers, which were sort of like a lower on the totem pole, so to speak. Now, their homes looked something like this. So there's actually one of these. If you go to Etowah Indian Mounds, it's an adobe thatch house. And so, they, like I said in the other PowerPoint, they made houses and clothing out of the items that they had, which lends itself to the question on one of the quizzes about how environment and geography impacts culture and things like that. Well, this is just part of that, right? You're going to eat and wear what is close to you. So, in terms of religion, the Mayans were polytheistic. The deities were ranked in order of importance, and they had human characteristics like Greek and Roman gods did. Human sacrifice was very prevalent among the Mayans. And so they had cities that were built around a central area dominated by a pyramid, which is sort of like a ziggurat, remember, with the steps. And around the city center were other temples and a sacred ball court. I think your quiz asked you about the ball court, which people group used it. And so that would be the Mayans, right? So here's a picture of it. It's a rectangular space. Human sacrifice was somehow connected with this game. We're not exactly sure how, but it had religious significance in some way. And I think that's important to say, as we get into exploration in our, I'm not sure, your class is going to be a little bit getting into that. The dual enrollment class will be a little bit sooner because they're going through this faster. But when we get into exploration, you know, there are connotations of supremacy in some of that. And but if you look at the societies, even the Native American peoples recognize that their society wasn't as advanced as the Europeans, and they felt inferior, and there are some primary sources that say that. However, they also talk about the materialism of the Europeans, how materialistic they were. But one of the positive things that came out of exploration was the eradication of human sacrifice. As culture was pushed on these people, some of them adopted Christianity, some of them just considered themselves polytheistic, and they added the God of Christianity to the rest of their gods. But in a lot of ways, it eradicated the practice of human sacrifice, which was a positive development. So Mayan hieroglyphs, I don't know if you remember, I think it was like 12 years ago, we thought the world was going to end because the Mayan calendar ended. And so there were some sinister things going around on YouTube and all about that. But Mayan hieroglyphs were both ideographic and phonetic. That is a quiz question. And so basically that just means they had sounds connected to them, phonetic, right? And so they're pictorial. So you can definitely see that from this image here. But the writing system developed around the first millennium BC. The calendar measures time back to a particular date, August and 3114 BC. And it was complex in that it required an understanding of constellations, astronomical events, and mathematics. So it was, and which is one of the reasons that when we got down to the end of it, people were quite worried because it was such a complex system. So the Maya had sophisticated knowledge of astronomy. They kept detailed records of the movements of the heavenly bodies. That was very common among almost all ancient civilizations. Even the pyramids, they would create shafts inside that would, where you could see certain stars at certain times of the year and things like that, which was very interesting. You have a class of scribes in Mayan society who were responsible for compiling official records. Most of the records have been destroyed, but you can find some like this. The cuneiform tablets are also like this too. They're very small, and they're usually like receipts for transactions and things like that. Kind of like our receipts that we get at the store today. It's the same thing, just a little bit more complex and lasting, I suppose, on these clay tablets. So, why did the Mayan civilization decline? Well, archaeologists aren't really sure. It happened sometime around the 8th or 9th century. They think that it's possible that the land was overcultivated and maybe there weren't enough crops to feed everyone. Water might have become scarce. And so it was just sort of a natural collapse, if you will. There could have been a drought, possibly. And so like I said, we're not really sure what really happened to the Mayans, but they broke apart and they ended up, forming all of these little groups, which, we'll talk more about that. Like I said, as we get into colonization, I'm probably going to have the dual enrollment class is going to watch a movie called The Mission and do a review on it. If the honors class, because I'm posting this particular PowerPoint for both classes because the content is very similar. The assignments are going to be very different though. So whereas like the dual enrollment students will complete a review on the mission, you guys will do something. I don't remember what your exploration activity is, but if you want to watch the movie The Mission, this is why I bring it up. It's a great movie about the work of the Jesuits in South America and all the little tribes that are down there. They're probably some kind of branch off of the Maya. And the work of Elizabeth Elliot. Think about if you know the story or the movie End of the Spear. I usually connect it with that because the movie The Mission and the movie End of the Spear are actually about neighboring tribes in South America. And so I think it's important to make those connections as well. So anyway, we're going to move on now to the Aztecs. So I'm going back up to Mexico. I was in South America, right on the coast where Chile is. Now I'm going to Mexico. And in Mexico, you have the Aztecs arriving sometime in the late 12th century. By the late 15th century, they became dominant. So remember, they were kind of like wandering around looking for an eagle eating a snake on a cactus, and they decided when they saw that, that's where they were going to settle. And so that happened, actually, truly happened in Mexico City. And that's how we got the capital there. And so, for the remainder of the 15th century, the Aztecs expanded their control of what is modern Mexico from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and as far south as the Guatemalan border. So here's their hierarchy. So we talked a lot about hierarchies already. So you've got the king or high priest at the top. So again, you have the line between church and state is fuzzy, right? Which is very common in ancient society. You have a council, often part of the royal family. You have nobles, merchants, and artisans, which tells us that art was important. And then commoners, farmers, and slaves down at the bottom. So the Aztec ruler claimed descent from the gods. So he was deified, unlike, remember, the mandate of heaven, he was chosen by the gods, but not a god. So this guy in the Aztec society would have been considered a god. When he died, the successor was chosen by a small group of senior officials, and the successor was usually from that royal family line. A prime minister served as chief executive of the government and was an advisor to the ruler. Outside of the capital, rulers of the territories were allowed autonomy in return for paying tribute to the central government. So taxes, yes, taxes were a thing in the ancient world. It's very common. How do you run a government if you don't have money, right? And so that's how the nobles sort of become rich is through taxation. Capulis, I believe this is a quiz question. And so again, we're talking about Aztec society. I think it asks you which society had Capulis. And basically, these are just large family groups, kinship groups, right? And so you have lots of family members, a lot like the society in China. Remember how we said the villages were based on family members? Well, that's what this is. They managed their own temples, they had their own schools. They were sort of like a little village within the society. They occupied separate neighborhoods, performed certain functions, and a lot of times they had certain skills. Like you might have one who's good at metalworking or stone cutting, weaving, or commerce would be like trade. So now within the Kapuli were smaller family units. So a Kapuli was like a big village made up of a lot of families who were sort of connected. And then you have these small families within. Gender roles were very important. So male children were trained for war and they were expected to serve in the army. Women were expected to work at home. They wove textiles, which is fabric, and they would raise the children. Both men and women could enter the priesthood, and women were permitted to own and inherit property, and they could enter into contracts, which was a little bit different from many other societies. Marriages were usually monogamous, which means one man, one woman. However, you could have polygamy if you were a noble. So that was sort of a special thing. So in Aztec society, you have rigidly stratified classes. So that means commoners were not permitted to enter the nobility. So whatever you were born as is sort of what you would be, right? It was very difficult to raise in status. Now, Aztec society involved a pantheon of gods, so they were polytheistic. Human sacrifice was common. It was considered an honor to be chosen for human sacrifice. It represented valor and nobility, and it was respected. Okay, so that brings us to the Inca. So the Inca launched a campaign of conquest. The boundaries of the empire were eventually extended as far as Ecuador. And Inca society was divided into provinces and districts. So here you have on the coast of Chile, was mostly where Inca society was situated. They completed impressive constructions due to large numbers of forced labor. So they did have slaves. I think that's important to note too. Um, there you have about 24,800 miles of highways and roads that were built to extend from the border of modern Colombia to southern Chile, which again is how many of, after you have the disbanding of other countries, that's how some of them were able to travel into the southern part of the land. So, rest houses and storage depots were placed along the roads. The use of highways were restricted, and train runners carried messages rapidly from one station to another. This enabled information to travel up to 140 miles in a single day. That's quite far. So here's the Quipu. Remember we talked about the Quipus with the Carlos Museum. This is how they would keep records. So you've got these strands and these knots, and all the knots sort of meant something. So farming was very common. You could actually count your crops on a Quipu. You might note how many family members you had on a Quipu. Marriage in Incan society was strictly regulated, and men and women married members of their own tribes. For women, the only way to avoid marriage was to serve in the temple. And the Inca had no writing system, but they kept records using a system called a quipu. All right, so that brings us to Oceania. Oceania is the last part of this lecture, and so this is it's actually an uncommon topic until about 1999, which I believe this question is on your exam as well. Um, it was kind of left out of the history books, and so you have Australia over here, so kind of get your bearings. New Guinea and New Zealand is here. And so they separate this into three segments because as you can see, you have many, many islands. So you've got Micronesia up here, Melanesia, and Polynesia. So Polynesia being the biggest one. So here you go. So in 1999, the reason it began to be studied was because you have some historians who were teaching out of Hawaii. And so they wrote a book called Traditions and Encounters, a global perspective on the past, where they made sure to include some things that had been left out. Now, when we talk about barriers to human migration, you would think that the sea would have been a barrier, but it was actually a method of transportation because of the way things were laid out. And I believe that's on your test as well. So you have the island of Rapa Nui is actually right here where this dot is. And so that's where you have these famous statues. You've probably seen them many times. The moai, they were used for ceremonial practice. And we talked about, when we covered the lecture on provenance and repatriation, I talked about UNESCO and how they have declared certain places as World Heritage Sites. Well, Rapa Nui is a World Heritage Site. It's also a great screensaver for your laptop and all kinds of things like that. So very important stuff. Now, if you go over to New Zealand, which is blinking here at you, the word Maori means native. And so Maori people arrived in New Zealand somewhere between 900 and 1300 AD. Now, there's a legend that an explorer named Kupe was the first to arrive via canoe from other Polynesian islands. We're not really sure how true that is. It might be though. But New Zealand is about the size of Italy. And so, with it being one of the largest islands, the Maori were just infatuated with it. They felt like they had struck gold. No one lived there. They were able to claim it. It had all kinds of really interesting wildlife, like the moa bird, which is now extinct, and the kiwi. And so, everything over there is sort of named Kiwi something. I had a friend who did some mission work over there, and she came back and I asked her about it, and she said, "Oh yeah, the roads are kiwi, the town." She said everything. So this is a kiwi bird, and it kind of looks like a kiwi a little bit. But the Maori had some very interesting customs. They practiced an art called moko, which was used for both beautification and quick identification. So that's all these tattoos on their face, right? They thought this was very attractive, and so Maori artists were like priests. They prayed to the gods while they worked, so there was a religious connotation to all of this as well. And today, they have traditional festivals where they celebrate their heritage, and it's common to see the men dressed in hemp skirts. They do these war dances where they stick out their tongues as far as they can, and they bulge their eyes, and they try to intimidate their enemies. And believe it or not, this actually worked for them. You know, when explorers would come to the island, they saw all of these people dancing around like this, and it scared them, and they left. So it's something to be celebrated today, right? Women, however, do not do these things. They're a little bit more graceful, and they have this little poi, which is a ball on a string, and they kind of spin it around. Now, the punamu or greenstone, which is actually jade, was very common on the island. And so, what you'll find in the artifacts is that many of them are made of jade. There's some very beautiful items. They were used as tools, weapon, and jewelry. So, according to oral tradition, because there are very few written records, there were some explorers who arrived in New Zealand around the mid 1600s. And a Dutch explorer named Abel Tasman named the island New Zealand after the Zeeland province in the Netherlands. And so you find that to be true in many places. It's usually named after some sort of European place. But Tasman was so afraid of the warriors with their bulging eyes and long tongues that he never actually landed on the island. And so, over 100 years later, you have Captain James Cook, who you may have heard of. He made maps of the region, and he introduced pork to the Maori. And so, and even today, they call pigs Captain Cookers after Captain Cook, which is kind of fun. So now Captain Cook's explorations paved the way for other Europeans to visit New Zealand. Much like in America, the colonists eventually outnumbered the natives, and today only about 6 of 10 of every 100 New Zealanders are of Maori descent. So colonization took a toll on them, like it took a toll on a lot of the other countries. And so today, New Zealand takes great pride in their heritage. You'll find a lot of statues that look like this. It's made to look like traditional Maori people. And what's really interesting, excuse me, this is actually, so remember they Christianized. I talked about how the Europeans came in and Christianized everything within, I mean, that was North America, South America, Central America, and it also happened here in Oceania. So this is actually supposed to be Mary holding the baby Jesus, and this is in Maori tradition. So it's a Madonna with child statue. And this is really common as well. What you find is when any nation converted to Christianity, or even like the Byzantine Empire or whatever, they would depict Mary and Christ in their own culture. So, like the Byzantine Empire might show them as a mosaic, or it might have certain features of that culture. And so it's very interesting how you have the same God, but painted to look like that people.